Welcome to the Behaviorist Book Club. We are a community of busy, research-focused BCBA practitioners just trying to stay in touch with the literature in our field. You can follow my website and my newsletter, www.behavioristbookclub.com, and my Twitter, @behavioristbc. This series is, of course, JABA in one take, where we break down a JABA article for the practitioner to enjoy and learn from. This article is from volume 54, number 4, the fall edition, written by Haley Stenheiser, William Ahern, Rebecca Foster, Mariah Jacobs, Cassidy Doggett, and Maddie Goad. The title is Examining Stereotypy in Naturalistic Context, Differential Reinforcement, and Context-Specific Redirection. Right away, we should be aware, of course, that this is an article covering the reduction of motor and vocal stereotypy. I think as I read that and as I say it to you, I think it prompts a little bit of a ethical pause, and it should for many BCBAs, due to the outcry from the autistic community about how we shouldn't be, as BCBAs, working to reduce those stemming and stereotypy behaviors, because that is a form of masking. And the community simply doesn't want that. They don't want to mask their autistic traits. And I think that's incredibly valid. And I really do support that argument. And as a practitioner, have really changed my views because of what I've learned from that community. However, I think that there are certain times when it is important to know how to reduce some of those stereotypic behaviors. For example, if those behaviors are really interfering with a child's access to other valuable reinforcers or the ability to learn other behaviors. So that might look like behaviors that interfere with the learning environment and can't be reduced through naturalistic antecedent style manipulations. And if this behavior continues, the child will never learn how to read or never learn how to do a lot of independent living skills that could lead to a much wider range of reinforcement. So just off the bat, I want to put that out there that I think it's rare that we as practitioners would really be targeting stereotypy. I think that, to be honest, it's something we shouldn't really focus on. However, I think when it does come up, it's really important we know how to work on it and how to work on it from an ethically appropriate lens. And that's really what this article is leading us to. It's taking us away from the old way of working on stereotypy and maybe suggesting a new, more appropriate way. So what are the effective interventions that have been used in the research world and in the clinical ABA world to reduce this stereotypic behavior? Well, the first is non-contingent access to stimuli. So this is more of a reinforcement-based way to work on this behavior. And what you're really looking at is the matching law. You want the reinforcement gained from the stimuli that you provide, such as the learning materials or the learning materials or the other interactive toys, to be higher than the reinforcement that they get from their stereotypic automatically maintained behavior. The other reinforcement-based way is the DRO. This is a very common intervention. So it's differential reinforcement of other behavior, and you set a time limit, usually maybe about half the time between stereotypic behaviors, and you reinforce the absence of that behavior with another preferred tangible or preferred reinforcer. And in that way, you slowly expand that time and the stereotypic behavior stays low. There's also punishment-based ways to reduce stereotypic behavior, such as response blocking. So actually with your hand or with the therapist's arm, stopping the behavior from continuing to occur. If the child is rocking back and forth in their seat, this could look like the therapist blocking the rock of the chair. And it could also look like the therapist putting in an antecedent intervention, such as removing the rocking chair and putting in a regular chair. There's also overcorrection, which is a pretty standard punishment-based procedure that we're going to actually talk a lot about in this article. And that's when the contingent on the stereotypic behavior, the child engages in some kind of functional skill repeatedly as a way to reduce that behavior from occurring again. And then in that same lens is response interruption and redirection, which is one of the most commonly used interventions. The way response interruption and redirection works is similar to overcorrection, but it's not a functional skill. It's typically a already mastered task that the child has not shown aversion to. So, for example, if the child you're working with has a stereotypy that involves scripting their favorite TV show, upon that script starting, what response interruption and redirection may call for is the therapist holding up a card that has a picture of a boat and saying, "What is this?" And then the child stops and gets interrupted from their stereotypy, says boat, the therapist praises, holds up another 2 cards, and the child answers those sequentially. And then the therapist says, "Great job," and then gives the next prompt or whatever they were doing. So if they were working on demands when the script started, they would do the next DTT trial or something like that. It's a really common intervention in stereotypy research, and it's also hugely useful in clinical settings. I've used it plenty of times myself, and it tends to be really effective. And the funny thing is that people don't really tact it as a punishment-based intervention. But if you think about it, the behavior is reducing, you're presenting stimuli contingent on a behavior, and the child is avoiding engaging in that behavior in the future, so the aversive stimulus is not presented. That's positive punishment. It doesn't feel like punishment when you're doing it. It feels a little more like skill acquisition, but in reality, it is a punishment procedure, and it has the same negatives and side effects that some punishment procedures have. It was originally developed and really brought to life by Ahern in 2007, and he focused on interrupting the stereotypy and redirecting to appropriate vocalization. So he was interrupting vocal stereotypy, redirecting to appropriate vocalizations. And then Martinez and Betts in 2013 did a full review of RIRD and really looked over the literature to look for holes and boundary conditions of the treatment. And what they found is that they didn't find a lot of evidence for generalization. Now, are we that surprised in a problem behavior reduction topic that we didn't see a lot of generalization? I'm not totally surprised because, frankly, a lot of times I feel like in the severe problem behavior research, you see the reversal, you see the reduction, and you call it a day. I don't see a lot of maintenance effects because the assumption is that the treatment's going to continue throughout the child's, until the behavior is no longer in the child's repertoire, which could take years. So I'm not too surprised I didn't find a ton of generalization for that. They also found that reinforcement of appropriate behavior was oftentimes a component kind of mixed into this RIRD. And so when you have 2 different components, especially a punishment procedure and a reinforcement-based procedure, you really get a mixed bag in terms of what's really causing the change in behavior. So you have a dependent variable, the stereotypy, and you have 2 independent variables, reinforcement and RIRD. So which one of those variables are really causing a change in the behavior? It kind of muddies the water from a practical standpoint. Additionally, a lot of new research has come out that notes the negatives of RIRDs, mainly that it is a punishment-based procedure. Oftentimes when you decrease one automatically maintained behavior, another automatically maintained behavior may become more intrusive. I saw this just the other day when I was working on a kid who engaged in pica, and I worked on reducing that. And when that reduced, what happened? Well, the kid started biting his hand. And I realized that in my rush to reduce pica, I made a key error in that I didn't give him an appropriate behavior or a replacement behavior. And that's another weakness of RIRD. And finally, it's just the fact that reinforcement should really be considered first. Reinforcement is by far probably the the first response from a BCBA in a behavior change setting. And when you start with RIRD, even though it doesn't feel punishing, it is a punishment procedure. Collin in 2012 aptly noted that in a way, overcorrection can be conceptualized as RIRD. So we kind of know that overcorrection feels a little, feels a little more punishment-y, but RIRD is really just repackaged overcorrection with one key difference. So in RIRD, the behavior that's being prompted to interrupt the stereotypy isn't functionally relevant. It doesn't matter to the context that the kid's in that they know what color a boat is or something like that. In contrast, overcorrection, the prompted behavior is functionally relevant, and oftentimes it's some kind of daily living skill. So I see overcorrection a lot in toilet training research, where the kid goes to the bathroom in his pants, and that triggers an overcorrection procedure that the therapist then walks the kid back and forth to the toilet and has them manned for bathroom each time, maybe 2 or 3 times before the overcorrection procedure is finished. So in this case, you're prompting a replacement behavior, you're prompting a functionally relevant behavior, and with the hope that skill acquisition develops. And in toilet training research, they find that it really does. And that's really powerful. Overcorrection is a powerful skill acquisition tool as well as a punishment-based tool. And they kind of, in my opinion, rebranded overcorrection and called it context-specific redirection with that same logic that this may lead to more functional skills. So for the rest of the article, I'm going to call it context-specific redirection, but what we're really doing is comparing RIRD we're seeing if context-specific redirection can be as effective and also teach more functional skills. We're also going to be looking at when context-specific redirection doesn't even need to be applied. And this is, I think, a real cool part of this article, is they looked at what if you just used the matching law and just added DRA for the appropriate behavior and didn't do anything to the stereotypic behavior. Would that be enough to reduce stereotypy? And then we're also going to evaluate this in multiple different settings, which was a weakness of the RIRD research as well. We're going to look at different demand settings and different interactive leisure sessions. Quick water break. Before we dive into the methods, of course, so all sessions were conducted in a classroom. The main dependent variable was the motor and vocal stereotypy, as well as the duration of the amount of time the therapist spent on redirection. So we were counting the child's behavior in terms of frequency of stereotypy, as well as the duration of therapist redirection. We looked at 4 different contexts. 2 of them were verbal operant contexts. So the first one was task intervals, writing and reading, depending on the skill level of the child. And the second one was demand initiation context. The context-specific appropriate behavior that they defined. So this is either the thing that they're applying the DRA on, so reinforcing, or the thing that they are using during their context-specific redirection. The context-specific appropriate behavior was responses and mands. In the leisure context, the other big context, there was solo leisure and interactive leisure. And the context-specific appropriate behavior was functional engagement with the items. It started off, of course, with a functional analysis that identified the behavior as automatically maintained, which is really important before you go through this whole process, before you use RIRD, is to confirm, of course, that your stereotypy is attention maintained. They then did a paired stimulus preference assessment to identify relevant reinforcers, and then they started their intervention. Their experimental design was actually a 4-component multiple schedule and an ABAB with an alternating treatment to evaluate the redirection versus the DRA. Really, really cool graphs that we'll go into later, but I really like the way they did that. The baseline that they used was the DRA condition, and they considered this the standard autistic clinic style of treatment. And that just means simple reinforcers contingent on appropriate behavior. In the verbal, there was, of course, the verbal operant training context, which included the tacting, listener responsing, etc. that we talked about. The MAND initiation, which looked like the child had to communicate I want on a menu of preferred items. So simple MAND training. During interactive leisure, it was a turn-taking game with contingent praise and prompting, depending on behavior. And then in the solo leisure context, 3 items were placed in front of the kid with no other contingencies, and tokens were eventually added for one of the participants to help in that DRA. So they first looked at, does DRA work to reduce the stereotypic behavior? If it didn't work, or when stereotypy interfered with high rates of contextually appropriate behavior occurring, they moved on to context-specific redirection. So context-specific redirection looked like this. Contingent on a stereotypic behavior, they paused the session timer. They implemented the redirection contingent on the stereotypy. And then they continued that redirection until 3 seconds were free of stereotypy, and then they resumed the session timer. Each of these context-specific redirections varied a little bit based on the kid who was going through the treatment, but one of the participants' name was Andy, and his context-specific redirection was 30 seconds of physical guidance in the interactive leisure condition, and then therapist shadowing hands in the verbal operant conditions. All of them were a little different, but the gist of it was all that we were redirecting to that contextually appropriate behavior using our overcorrection procedures. So let's take a second and walk through what these graphs really looked like. So when they said a multiple baseline across different conditions, what their multiple baseline was across was the interactive leisure, the verbal operant tacting, listener training, etc., the solo leisure, and then the MAND condition. So for Andy, for the first component of his multiple baseline for interactive leisure, they started with the DRA condition, and they wanted to see if stereotypy was occurring or functional engagement was occurring. If stereotypy was low and functional engagement was high, well, that's great. That means DRA was enough. But if that wasn't the case, or it was undifferentiated, then they would move to context-specific redirection. Then after they got good results with context-specific redirection, so functional appropriate behavior was high, they reversed back into DRA and then reversed back into context-specific redirection. At the next phase, they did verbal operant training and did the same kind of switches. So they looked at DRA, they saw what happened, they went to context-specific redirection, then DRA, then context-specific redirection. And then for solo leisure and MAN training, they actually just used the DRA. They didn't even use the context-specific redirection, and that signaled that the DRA was sufficient to reduce stereotypy, and it wasn't interfering with the context-appropriate or the contextually appropriate behavior, which is really powerful. It shows that not all conditions was stereotypic behavior really interfering. We didn't need to use a punishment-based overcorrection, context-specific redirection, RIRD, whatever you want to call it. We didn't need to use that in every condition. That's really powerful. I want to talk about that a little bit later after we wrap up results. But over 9 out of the 10 contexts that used redirection was successfully reduced with context-specific redirection. This supports the idea that stereotypy does sometimes occur because of a lack of functional skills, which the context-specific redirection was targeted at teaching. It also, I think, supports the idea that RIRD isn't the only tool out there to reduce stereotypy. And I think it's probably actually better to use something like context-specific redirection because of that emphasis on skill acquisition. You kind of dodge the issue of not teaching an appropriate behavior by using your appropriate behavior as your overcorrection mechanism. It also, like I said, is really interesting that not every context needed context-specific redirection to reduce stereotypy. I think a lot of people, and myself included, sometimes miss this. Behaviors aren't inappropriate or appropriate. It's not maladaptive or not maladaptive. It's just dependent on the environment. You don't need to use the same interventions across every single environment. In fact, just like we don't have the same items around us and the same reinforcement protocols at work versus home versus in bed, we don't have the same, we shouldn't apply the same context to a kid's whole life. And I think that when you look at some of the ethical arguments against reducing stereotypy, one of the things that the community, the autistic community, sometimes brings up is that we never give the autistic community a chance to breathe, a chance to be autistic. And I think what this article shows is that we don't need to apply our interventions across the board. We should be using our interventions as if we were a surgeon, with precision, only in context where it's needed. So overall, this article does a really good job of extending the research on RIRD and context-specific redirection over correction, and it presents a lot of potential advantages for the context-specific redirection. And I think it's something that all therapists and BCBA should kind of have at the front of their mind when thinking about reducing stereotypy. My key takeaways from this is that, first, BCBAs really should evaluate what context stereotypy is really a problem. Is it actually a problem? Or is it just something that the teacher or the parent or even you are uncomfortable with and don't really want to work around? And if it really is a problem, if it really is interfering with the child really making great strides, then look only to apply your intervention in that specific context. Let the kid have their stereotypy and have their stemming in every environment that they can, and maybe only apply your intervention in specific contexts. With that, I think it's also important to note that context-specific redirection may have a tentative advantage. I think we need a lot more research. I wish this article did more of a context-specific redirection versus RIRD analysis, and maybe even a look at the creation of functional skills. They kind of looked at that a little bit when they went into the increase in MANs or the increase in engagement with these items, but they didn't really dive into it. And I think that would be really interesting to see. And finally, for your consideration as you step into your office or do your remote work or whatever you're doing, think about what interventions you've used maybe across the board in every single context for a kid, when really you maybe should have looked into more of a precise provision of that assessment in specific environments. I know that this article really prompted me to think about times when I should have been a lot more precise, but instead I just kind of threw it all in there. And I think that was a mistake that I'm going to have to change when I finish recording this podcast. So that is all from this article, my friends. You can see the show notes at my website, www.behavioristbookclub.com, and pop into that blog section. You can also follow me on Twitter at behavioristbc, and I also have a Facebook group, the Behaviorist Book Club on Facebook. This was our Monday episode, and I will see you all on Wednesday.